April 1945. Germany was collapsing in on itself. Allied armies were closing from east and west, pressing inward like a tightening vise. Cities lay shattered. Rail lines were torn apart. Columns of refugees moved along broken roads. The Third Reich, which had once promised 1,000 years of power and destiny, was entering its final weeks. But near the historic city of Weimar, behind barbed wire and guard towers, the machinery of imprisonment and death had not fully stopped. Buchenwald stood on a wooded hill just outside the city. For years, smoke had risen from its crematorium. Trains had arrived under darkness. Prisoners had passed through its gates and vanished from public sight. Yet many citizens in nearby Weimar would later insist that they knew nothing of what was taking place there. On April 11, 1945, American forces reached the camp. What they found was not a battlefield. It was evidence. The soldiers who entered Buchenwald encountered a landscape of organized brutality. Thousands of prisoners were still alive, but barely. Many were skeletal, their bodies reduced to bone and stretched skin. Starvation and disease had hollowed their faces. They moved slowly, if they moved at all. Thousands more were dead. Bodies lay stacked in courtyards and barracks. Mass graves scarred the ground. The crematorium ovens were still warm. It was not chaos in the sense of sudden destruction. It was the aftermath of a system that had functioned with method and routine. Days later, General George S. Patton arrived to inspect the camp. Patton was no stranger to violence. He had commanded troops in North Africa and across Europe. He had seen battlefields littered with the fallen. He had witnessed the destruction of cities and the human cost of mechanized war. But Buchenwald was different. This was not the fury of combat. It was organized, systematic murder carried out over time. Patton walked through the gates and entered a world that even seasoned officers struggled to comprehend. He moved through barracks where men had slept 3 to a bunk. He saw prisoners too weak to stand. He saw emaciated bodies awaiting burial. The smell of death hung heavy in the air. Even those accustomed to war found themselves shaken. For Patton, the shock hardened into anger. Buchenwald was not hidden in a distant wilderness. It was only a few miles from Weimar, one of Germany's most celebrated cultural centers, the city of Goethe, a place associated with music, philosophy, literature, and learning. How could such a camp operate so close to such a city? How could thousands be imprisoned, abused, and killed without anyone knowing? Many local citizens claimed ignorance. They said they had heard nothing. They insisted they had seen nothing. They maintained that they had no idea what had taken place beyond the fences. Patton did not accept that explanation. He understood that the war was nearing its end. Trials would follow. Investigations would begin. Nations would begin to rebuild. And already he sensed the beginnings of denial. If the local elite, the mayor, businessmen, professionals, could claim they had known nothing, then responsibility might dissolve into silence. The crimes might be reduced to rumor. So Patton made a decision. He ordered that the mayor of Weimar and other prominent citizens be brought to Buchenwald. These were not random civilians taken from the street. They were respected figures in the community, individuals with influence and education, people who represented the authority and social standing of the city. They were to be taken to the camp, not for negotiation, not for punishment, but for confrontation. When the civilians arrived, they were escorted through the same gates prisoners had once passed. American soldiers guided them beyond the barbed wire, past the guard towers, into the heart of the camp. They walked through the barracks. Survivors stared at them, hollow-eyed, silent, exhausted. Men who had endured starvation, forced labor, beatings, and disease now stood face to face with citizens from the nearby city. They passed stacks of corpses awaiting burial. They were brought to the crematorium. The ovens stood as mute witnesses. Ashes remained. Bones lay nearby. The scale of death was undeniable. American soldiers required them to look closely, to step nearer, to see not from a safe distance, but face to face. Some covered their mouths against the stench. Some wept. Some repeated that they had known nothing. Others stood stiff and silent. But abstraction had ended. The horror was no longer rumor. It was physical and immediate. In certain cases, civilians were ordered to assist in burying the dead. They carried bodies. They helped dig graves. They confronted the consequences not as distant observers, but as participants in the aftermath. For the survivors of Buchenwald, this moment carried its own meaning. For years, they had been reduced to numbers, stripped of identity, dehumanized. Now, the very citizens who had lived comfortably nearby were being marched through the camp as witnesses to their suffering. It did not undo the past. It did not restore the dead. But it forced a meeting between two realities: the horror within the camp and the normal life beyond its fences. Patton's order was not an impulsive act. It was deliberate. He believed that the German people, especially those in positions of influence, needed to see what had occurred under the regime they had lived beside. Whether they had supported it, tolerated it, or ignored it, the crimes had happened in their country, near their homes, under their government. He feared what would follow if they were permitted to distance themselves from it. War fades quickly into myth. Atrocities can be minimized. Evidence can be denied. Memory can be reshaped. But a person who has walked through a camp filled with corpses cannot easily claim exaggeration. By compelling Weimar's elite to witness Buchenwald, Patton was creating witnesses who could not deny what they had seen. He was strengthening the record. He was making it more difficult for local leadership to dismiss the camp as Allied propaganda. This was not legal accountability. That would come later in courtrooms such as Nuremberg. It was moral accountability. The presence of Buchenwald so close to Weimar raised a question that would echo for decades. How much had ordinary Germans known? Some historians argue that many citizens were aware of camps but did not understand the scale of murder. Others suggest that visible signs, smoke, trains, the disappearance of neighbors, made total ignorance unlikely. The truth likely differed from one individual to another. But on that day in April 1945, ambiguity ended for those who walked through the gates. The mayor could no longer claim distance. Business leaders could no longer insist they had no idea. The educated, cultured elite of Weimar stood in the presence of what had happened within sight of their city. In the hours and days that followed, word spread quickly. People whispered about what the mayor had seen, about the bodies, about the burial details, about the Americans who had shown little patience for excuses. For many citizens, the visit shattered the illusion that the crimes of the war had occurred somewhere far away. The camp had not been an abstract rumor. It had been a physical place, close enough for smoke to be visible on certain days, close enough for trains to be heard arriving at night. American military authorities ensured that journalists, photographers, and cameramen documented everything. Photographs were taken, film footage was recorded, reports were written. Images of Buchenwald began to circulate beyond Germany, confronting audiences with the reality of what had been uncovered. Patton understood that this moment extended beyond Weimar. It was about shaping the historical record. If respected local leaders acknowledged what they had witnessed, it would strengthen the credibility of the evidence. It would make future denial more difficult. Less than a month later, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. The regime collapsed. But the memory of what had been discovered at places like Buchenwald would shape the world that followed. In the years after the war, many Germans reflected on what they had known, suspected, or ignored. Some claimed they had been powerless. Others admitted they had turned away. Some insisted they had not understood the scale of what was happening. Yet the images from April 1945 endured. The sight of respected citizens walking past piles of bodies, the shock on their faces, the silence. For the civilians who had been compelled to tour the camp, the experience could not be undone. They returned to their homes in a defeated nation. They began rebuilding lives amid ruin. But the images remained. Skeletal survivors, silent barracks, the presence of the crematorium. April 1945 marked not only the end of a regime, but the beginning of a reckoning. Under the watch of American soldiers, influential citizens were forced to confront a truth that could no longer be hidden behind distance or denial. That day was not simply about humiliation, it was about recognition. A society cannot rebuild itself on denial. It cannot face its future without acknowledging its past. Patton believed that confronting horror directly was necessary if Germany was to move forward. Shielding the elite from what had happened would allow myth and revisionism to take root. Instead, he exposed them to the truth. The collapse of the Third Reich was military. The confrontation at Buchenwald was moral. In the decades that followed, Germany would undergo a long and painful process of reckoning. Education, memorials, trials, and public remembrance would become central to its identity. But in April 1945, that process began in a stark and immediate way, with a forced walk through a camp filled with evidence. Smoke no longer rose from the crematorium. The guards had fled. The regime was crumbling. But the truth remained. And on that day, Germany's rich and powerful were made to stand before it. No speeches, no ideology, no distance. Only the reality of what had been done.